For 20 years, they stepped over him in the hallway, cracked jokes behind his back, and never once said his name, until the day he walked into the boardroom, owned the company, and fired every last one of them. Nobody ever looked twice at Howard Ellison. He was just there, mopping floors by the vending machines, wiping down the glass doors before sunrise, rolling his yellow cart past rows of cubicles, humming under his breath while everyone else powered through emails or clocked out without a word. At Morningside Tech in Mesa, Arizona, he was the janitor. No title, no recognition. No, "Good morning, Mr. Ellison." Most didn't even know his last name. Some called him Howie. Others forgot he had a name at all. "Hey, you missed a spot," one manager once joked, while spilling his coffee intentionally, walking away laughing with 2 interns. Howard just looked at the stain, squatted down, and cleaned it like it didn't sting. But it did. For 20 years, Howard showed up at 9 p.m., left at 6 a.m., 6 nights a week. Same uniform, same quiet pace. He didn't eat in the break room. He didn't make friends. He didn't take days off. Even the building's badge scanner beeped like it was tired of seeing him. What they didn't see, what they never bothered to ask, was the mind behind the mop. Howard had once been something else. Not a CEO, not a Harvard grad, but a sharp, sharp man. He built things with his hands, took apart radios as a teenager just to understand how they ticked. Life had knocked him down a few times. A bad investment, a family member who ran off with his savings, a son he hadn't seen in 14 years. But Howard didn't talk about that. He worked, he observed, and every night he listened. The clink of glass in the executive lounge, the whispers behind closed doors, the careless comments from tired employees who forgot someone was there, someone paying attention. "Man, if I owned this place, I'd gut the whole operations team," he once overheard. The irony wasn't lost on him. The floor of Morningside was cold, not physically. They kept it at a cozy 72, but cold in the way that makes you feel invisible. The kind of cold that sets in when people walk past you like you're part of the furniture. Still, he showed up. He once found a pair of expensive cufflinks left in the restroom, gold ones with the initials GB engraved. He placed them in a small bag and left them at the receptionist's desk without a note. That same day, a VP walked past him and said, "Man, you people never quit, huh? You people." Howard didn't flinch. He didn't report it. He didn't even slow down. He just kept cleaning. Because while everyone else at Morningside saw a man pushing a mop, Howard saw something else. Numbers. Opportunity. Silence. Time. And time had been working with him, not against him. But there was one thing they hadn't figured out, and it would change everything. Howard knew better than to move fast. He'd learned that lesson the hard way in his late 30s, when a failed trucking business left him with nothing but debt and an old Ford pickup. Since then, patience had been his currency. So while he scrubbed coffee stains off conference room tables, he studied people. Not just how they treated him, that was obvious, but how they treated each other. Who deferred to whom? Who lied? Who was sloppy with emails and careless with their passwords? Who stayed late and who always found excuses to leave early? He wasn't being nosy. He was learning. There was a time, years back, when Howard used to speak more. Back when his wife was alive and his teenage son still called him Dad with pride. But after his wife passed and the relationship with his son dissolved, Howard stopped talking and started listening. And in the quiet, he began to notice everything. The company was profitable but messy. Too many middle managers, too much waste. No one seemed to notice the slow bleed. But Howard did. He'd walk by forgotten whiteboards filled with strategy sessions and half-erased numbers. He'd pick up discarded printouts with budget projections or internal memos. Every piece of paper, every offhand conversation, it all told a story, and Howard remembered every bit of it. Sometimes during breaks, he'd sit in the janitor's closet and make notes in a small leather notebook. Not in full sentences, just names, dates, percentages. Quiet math. It was around this time that the idea started forming. He didn't have a name for it yet, didn't know how he'd pull it off. But he knew this. If he played it slow, kept his head down, and moved with intention, he could flip the whole script. One night, as he was cleaning the executive wing, he overheard a conversation between two board members in town for a quarterly review. They were talking mergers, shares, buyouts. Their voices were low, but not low enough. They didn't expect the janitor to understand a word, but Howard understood everything. He went home that morning and sat in his kitchen, staring at the old newspaper rack next to the fridge. It was empty now. Nobody read papers anymore. But he remembered the feeling of flipping through the financial section as a younger man. It had always made him feel small. Not anymore. The next week, he made a call to a man he hadn't spoken to in over 25 years. Clarence Boone, an old friend from Birmingham, who now worked as a private financial consultant. Clarence owed him a favor. A big one. They met in a quiet diner off the highway in Tucson. Howard wore his uniform. Clarence wore a linen shirt and loafers. He looked at Howard with wide eyes. "Man, what are you doing in that outfit?" "Keeping my mouth shut," Howard said. "But I think I'm ready to make some moves." He laid out his plan, piece by piece. Clarence was skeptical at first, but as the coffee cooled and Howard kept talking, his expression changed. "You want to buy into the company you clean?" "Not me," Howard said. "A name you'll help me create." They formed a small LLC with Clarence as the face. Howard funneled in savings, inheritance, even sold off his truck and a small patch of land he'd held onto for decades. Nothing flashy, just enough to buy a small number of shares, anonymously. No one at Morningside noticed. Why would they? It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. It was quiet. And quiet things grow without warning. But that first buy-in wouldn't be the last, and one spilled bucket would push everything forward faster than Howard planned. It happened during a late Tuesday shift in June, one of those nights when the desert air in Mesa doesn't cool, even after sunset. Howard had just finished cleaning the third-floor bathrooms and was headed to the executive meeting space to take out the trash. He was careful, as always. Never left water on the tiles. Never made noise. But that night, something slipped. His bucket caught on the corner of a door frame. The soapy water inside sloshed forward, splattering across the polished floor of Conference Room B, right in front of a group of mid-level managers reviewing slides for an upcoming investor pitch. There was silence, then laughter. "Jesus, Howie," barked Gil Brandon, one of the louder VPs. "Can you not ruin the floor for once? This is why you people stay where you are." Howard didn't look up. He just reached into his cart for paper towels. But Gil wasn't finished. "Get someone who knows what the hell they're doing," he added, waving to one of the interns like Howard wasn't even there. "I swear, this is why we outsource this crap." Howard wiped the floor slowly, without saying a word. He could feel eyes on him. Not one person offered to help. No one asked if he was okay. He left the room quietly, but that moment burned in his chest. Not because it was new, he'd been talked down to before, but because Gil had laughed like he was proud of it. Later that night, in the janitor's closet, Howard took out his notebook. He wrote one word: Brandon. Then he turned the page and began to sketch out numbers. That was the moment things shifted. Howard's first set of shares had already been purchased under a shell corporation Clarence helped him set up. Granite Rise Partners. It sounded like a real firm. Clean. Neutral. It held just under 1% of Morningside's private equity at that point. Barely enough to be noticed. Barely enough to matter. But now? Now it wasn't just an idea anymore. Now he had fire in his belly. Gil had accelerated something that was already in motion. Every paycheck after that went straight to the plan. Howard moved into a smaller apartment, sold his late wife's wedding ring, something he'd kept in a drawer for years. He told himself she would have understood, that it wasn't about revenge, that it was about building something bigger than resentment. By the end of the year, Granite Rise held nearly 3% of the company. No one at Morningside paid attention. The company was expanding, growing fast. They'd opened a second office in Tempe, and the leadership was busy juggling investors and quarterly reports. They didn't ask about small equity shifts, especially not from a quiet firm that never attended board meetings or filed complaints. But Howard watched it all. He listened to the same voices every night, laughing in the break room, whispering secrets in glass offices. And while they slept, he studied. Each December, Morningside's less active shareholders had the option to sell off shares back to the company or to private third-party buyers. Howard, through Granite Rise, quietly began acquiring small blocks of those shares, one here, one there. The process was slow, painstaking. Some nights he'd come home and wonder if it was all just some ridiculous fantasy. But then he'd remember Gil's smirk. He'd remember the way employees dodged his cart like he was in their way. He'd remember how invisible he had become, and how powerful that invisibility really was. Clarence called him once a month to check in. "You really want to keep going?" he'd ask. Howard always answered the same. "Until I can sit in the front of the building without a mop in my hand." But Howard didn't know yet that the final piece of his plan would come from an unexpected insult that cut deeper than any before. It was a Friday night in early February when it happened. The office was emptier than usual. Most of the staff had left early for a company-sponsored retreat in Sedona. Only a few people remained in the building, finishing up reports and tying loose ends before the weekend. Howard was cleaning the break room when two junior marketing associates walked in mid-conversation, laughing louder than they probably realized. "I mean, come on, have you seen the janitor's shoes? They look like he fished them out of a dumpster." "Bet he doesn't even have a bank account," the other said, sipping from her LaCroix. "He probably gets paid in quarters." They didn't see him standing behind the vending machine. They didn't care. Howard froze, not because their words hurt in some new way, but because something inside him clicked. This wasn't just about building wealth anymore, or making a point. It was about respect, about how easily people forgot that the ones they stepped over might one day stand taller than them. That night, after everyone left, Howard didn't clean. He sat on a crate in the supply closet and stared at the wall for nearly an hour. Then he picked up his phone and dialed Clarence. "We're speeding things up," he said. "I want to be in that boardroom by the end of next year." Clarence exhaled on the other end. "You sure about that?" "I'm not waiting for people to change," Howard said. "I'm going to change the room." The next 6 months were a blur. Howard used every trick in the book. He worked with Clarence to open 3 additional shell companies, all in different names, each legally distinct, each holding a growing number of Morningside shares. He stayed anonymous, always. One of the firms, Tideswell Holdings, even received a mention in an internal investor newsletter. No one looked deeper. By the end of August, the combined holdings of Howard's LLCs made up 14% of the company's private equity, just shy of the threshold to trigger mandatory board notification. But Howard had a plan for that, too. He found 2 silent partners, retired teachers from Scottsdale, and offered them a cut if they agreed to act as figureheads. Clarence made the introductions. They were good people, sharp enough to follow instructions, humble enough to know when not to ask too many questions. In October, one of the LLCs hit 5% ownership. Then another. Then another. Still, no one at Morningside asked a single question. They were too busy making upgrades to the executive parking lot, too busy flying out to San Francisco for digital strategy sessions, too busy handing out leadership awards to each other. And Howard? He was still pushing a mop, still holding doors for interns who didn't say thank you, still eating sandwiches out of a cooler in the supply room. But now he was attending shareholder meetings, quietly, in the back, with a notepad and a pair of reading glasses. He never spoke, never even raised a hand. But he was there, listening, taking notes, learning the exact language they used when pretending to care. It was surreal, watching the same men and women who once rolled their eyes at him talk about inclusive culture and sustainable leadership He nearly laughed once when Gil Brandon gave a presentation on empathy in corporate environments. But Howard didn't laugh. He just wrote Gil's name again in his notebook. Then he circled it. By December, Howard's combined holdings had reached 49%, 1% away from controlling interest. The next available batch of shares would be offered in March. He already had the paperwork filled out. All he needed was time. But just as everything lined up, someone inside the company finally noticed, and what they did nearly derailed the whole plan. The email came out of nowhere. Howard had just clocked out, heading to his car in the still, dark morning when Clarence called him, voice low and urgent. "Someone's poking around," Clarence said. A junior compliance analyst flagged the ownership pattern. They noticed 3 of the LLCs bought shares in the exact same window, all with similar structures. Howard didn't say anything at first. "They haven't traced it back to you yet," Clarence continued, "but they're asking questions. You've got 2 options, disappear now or show your hand." Howard sat in the driver's seat of his 2002 Corolla, hands resting on the wheel. He didn't need to think about it. He was done hiding. "I'll handle it," he said, then hung up. That entire weekend, he stayed up revising the final draft of the ownership filings. He put everything into one clear statement. A full disclosure of ownership across his shell companies, legally signed, verified, and dated. On Monday morning, he drove to Morningside Tech in a navy blue suit. It was his first time wearing anything other than his janitor uniform in that building. Security didn't recognize him. One even tried to stop him at the front desk. Howard didn't raise his voice. He didn't flash anger. He simply handed over a sealed envelope and asked that it be delivered to the board of directors before their 10 a.m. meeting. Then he walked out. By noon, the CEO, Olivia Perrin, was on the phone trying to get answers. Who was this Howard Ellison? Why did a former janitor suddenly own 51% of the company? They ran checks, scrambled through legal filings, cross-checked signatures. Everything was airtight. The LLCs were legitimate. The transfers were legal. The structure, clean as a whistle. At exactly 1:15 p.m., Howard walked back in. This time he didn't use the service elevator. He took the front one, up to the top floor. No badge required. They were expecting him now. When he entered the boardroom, the same people who had passed him for years without a glance were seated around a long walnut table, stunned into silence. Olivia stood first. "Mr. Ellison, we didn't realize." Howard raised a hand gently. "I'm not here to be congratulated." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single manila folder, set it on the table, opened it. Inside were 4 termination letters, signed, effective immediately. The room froze. Howard looked directly at Gil Brandon. The VP who spilled coffee and made jokes like cruelty was sport. "You forgot my name for 20 years, Howard said, "but I never forgot yours." Gil opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His skin had gone pale. Howard turned to the rest of the board. "These 4 individuals no longer represent the values this company needs to move forward. Their actions, though never documented formally, have created a culture of disrespect, silence, and smallness. That ends today." A murmur rose. Someone tried to interrupt, but Howard's presence had grown so loud, no one dared challenge him. Olivia attempted to recover the room. "Mr. Ellison, this is highly irregular." Howard looked at her calmly. "What's irregular is letting disrespect run unchecked for years. What's irregular is letting culture rot while you hold luncheons about diversity and growth." He didn't yell. He didn't gloat. He just said the truth, and they had no response. After a long silence, Olivia finally said, "And what now?" Howard gathered his papers. "Now I start fixing what should have been fixed long ago." But Howard still had one more thing to say before leaving that room, something that would leave an even deeper mark than the firings themselves. He could have walked out right then and there, the moment the room fell silent, the moment power shifted like a weight in the air. But Howard had carried this story too long to end it without finishing the last chapter properly. He leaned slightly forward, resting his hands on the table. "You all built this place to look good on the outside. Slick branding, press releases, charity drives. But inside, it's rot. Not because of the work, because of the people leading it. He turned to Gil Brandon first. I remember every time you mocked me, Gil. The time I slipped and you called me pathetic. The time I opened the door for your mother and you told her I was one of the night guys, don't worry about him. I remember you laughing when you thought I couldn't hear. Gil stared at the table, jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. You're fired, Howard said quietly. Effective immediately. Your badge will no longer grant access after today. Security will escort you out. Next, he shifted to Morgan Fielding, the compliance director who once told a joke at a Christmas party about people who clean for a living because they didn't try hard enough in school. Howard hadn't been invited to that party. He'd heard the story from the night receptionist. You fired 2 janitorial temps last year because of a single late clock-in, he said. But let your own team slide for missing project deadlines for 6 months. You smiled in HR meetings and lied through your teeth, her mouth opened. I've given 10 years to... You took more than you gave. You're out. 2 more followed. Ken DeVere, head of internal strategy, and Dana Briggs, executive director of communications. Both had smiled to his face and rolled their eyes the second he walked away. Both had contributed to the culture of arrogance that trickled down every hallway like a slow leak. Each termination was followed by stunned silence. No shouting, no protests, just red faces and clenched jaws. One board member, a soft-spoken man named Raul Navarro, finally broke the silence. Mr. Ellison, why didn't you come forward earlier? We could have handled this quietly. Howard turned to him, his voice calm. I spent 20 years being quiet, watching you all pretend to value people while ignoring the ones who made the lights stay on. I didn't need you to handle it. I needed you to see it. The meeting adjourned in silence. Gil and the others left the building with security at their backs. No farewell lunches, no handshakes. Howard stood in the hallway afterward, staring out over the open concept floor where dozens of employees typed away. Some looked up. Most didn't recognize him. But a few did. A woman from accounting, Leah Armstrong, stepped forward. She'd always greeted him when she worked late, always thanked him when he emptied her bin. I heard what happened upstairs, she said softly. Is it true? Howard gave a single nod. She smiled. Took long enough. He smiled back. That afternoon, he called a meeting with HR and requested a full review of all contractor policies, promotion records, and internal complaint filings. He promoted 2 staff members who'd been overlooked for years, including a maintenance supervisor named Roy Chen, who had been running the janitorial operations since before Howard arrived. Roy deserves a real title, Howard told them, and a real office. The next week, every single department received new training on ethics, leadership, and workplace equity, not led by consultants, but by people within the company who had lived through the bad culture and still chose to stay. Howard never raised his voice. He didn't throw a party or give a speech. He just kept showing up, walking the halls, asking questions, listening, the same way he always had. But as the company began to heal, Howard started thinking about something else entirely. What comes after a mission is finally complete. Howard never wanted the spotlight. That's not why he did any of it. He hadn't built his quiet empire out of ego or to be called Sir by the same people who used to walk past him like a piece of equipment. He didn't need recognition. He needed something real, change. And now that it had begun, he found himself tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, the kind that sits in your bones after you've carried something for too long. A few months after the firings, the company's atmosphere started to shift. You could feel it in the little things. People held the elevator for each other. Interns introduced themselves to the cleaning staff. Managers started eating lunch in common areas instead of locking themselves away in private offices. Howard spent the next year overseeing operations, not from a throne, but from a desk with a squeaky chair and a coffee pot that barely worked. He insisted that frontline employees get quarterly feedback sessions with directors. He had the janitorial team's wages increased by 20%. He made sure every contractor had a voice in the room. Still, he He stayed quiet about his own story. It wasn't printed in company newsletters, no press releases, just a silent correction made where it mattered. By the time the second year rolled around, Howard had already begun planning his exit. He met with Raul Navarro, the only board member who had responded with honesty when asked why no one had noticed. "I want to hand this off," Howard told him. "Not to another suit. To someone who listens." Raul nodded. "You've got someone in mind?" "Leah Armstrong," Howard said. "She sees people. Always did." Leah had started as a junior accountant. She'd moved slowly up the ranks, never loud, never boastful, just like Howard. She knew the name of every janitor. She took the time to ask questions, she noticed. With the board's approval, Howard transitioned his voting power and stepped away from the day-to-day. No speech, no ceremony. He left the building one last time in the same car he'd parked in that lot for 18 years. That night, he drove out past the city limits, pulled over off Route 60, rolled down the window, and let the desert wind wash over him. He thought of his wife, of his son, of all the nights he'd pushed that cart in silence, dreaming of something better. He didn't feel anger anymore, or pride, just peace. In his back pocket was a folded note, the one he'd left in Leah's new office drawer. It read, "Power isn't about being seen. It's about seeing what others don't, and doing something about it." Back at Morningside, they kept a photo of him in the break room. Not a portrait, just a candid shot of him mopping the lobby, headphones in, humming some old Motown tune. And next to the photo was a plaque. Small, no gold trim, no bold letters, just 5 simple words. The man who paid attention. Howard never came back to the building. He spent his days volunteering at a community garden and tutoring kids in basic math at a public library in Tempe. No one there knew who he was, and that's how he liked it. Because the lesson he wanted to leave behind wasn't about money or revenge or even justice. It was about humility, about the value of listening, about remembering that the person sweeping your floors might one day own the building. So before you speak, look. Before you judge, pause. And before you ignore someone, ask yourself, what if they've been watching you all along? If this story made you think, even for a second, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more real stories that remind us who we're supposed to be, hit subscribe. Let's keep each other accountable.